This is Fred Beck from Fred Talks Fighting. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Steve Bunce. So thank you very much for coming on, Steve. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Fred. Thanks for having me on.
So Steve, if we go back a few years to how you originally got into journalism, at my age, at the age of 17, you boxed as an amateur and you also played football. Then you realised you didn't want to pursue either of those two sports professionally. So when did you realise that you wanted to get into journalism then?
Before I realised I wouldn't be a boxer, to be honest with you. But I had a feeling I could do both for a while. Boxing starts to hurt and you have to get very serious by about 16 or so. So that was about when I finished. Actually, it was nearly 18, but hey-ho. I think I turned off in my head at 16. I was already at that point wondering how I could stay in the business. I didn't want to be a manager or a promoter. I didn't really fancy being a trainer, although I was by 18 and 19 training fighters at an amateur boxing club in South London called the Fitzroy Lodge. I trained fighters 2 or 3 nights a week for 2 or 3 years. So, but I realised that I wanted a bit more than that, because back then it was a slow road. You work with the amateurs for years and years and years and years, and then you might work with some pros, and then when you get to about 50, you might have a champion. It's the other way around now. You literally just need to watch a bit of something on YouTube, and you can have a world champion in the first fight you have. It's a bizarre system we have now. Back then, it was a different system, and I got into journalism through the back door. Lots of people get in through that back door. It's a crowded corridor leading to that back door. And basically what it is, there was a man called Wally Bartleman, who had worked for the Evening Standard in London since after the war. The Great War, or not the Great War, the Second World War. In 1945, managed to get injured on about the last day of action. He managed to lose a bit of his leg. But the Evening Standard took him back, and he was writing about boxing through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. By the time I knew him in about the early 80s, he was getting on a bit. And then by about 1984, he was really getting on, but he liked a pound note, did Wally. And I became Wally's eyes and ears. So Wally, who was basically living at home he lived out in Harrow somewhere out in Middlesex, he would ask me to go and cover fights for him. And back then, the Evening Standard covered things like the army against London. That would be like 300 words. Or it covered things like, I don't know, South London against Kent in a barrack somewhere. I mean, it was really bizarre. So I'd go and do results for Wally because he was literally too old to go. And I used to have to phone him up at about 5 o'clock in the morning and give him the story. And then every month I'd get a check. And it would be a big old check. It would really bizarre, big old fat check. And it would be for various amounts, things like £37.28p. Or I remember the first time I got something like about 240 quid, thinking, oh my God, this is unbelievable. I can make £240 for going to boxing and calling someone up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Hallelujah. So eventually I kept on doing more work for Wally. And then he suggested, he had a very click in his voice. He said, you gotta branch out. You gotta do more. You gotta do some more. So he suggested I offer stuff to Boxing News. So from about 1984, I was filing very short stories for Boxing News. Wally's famous for several things. A, he helped me. B, he lost a bit of his leg in the Second World War. But what he's really famous for was being the only one of over 80 journalists who went to the thing called the Sunshine Showdown, when George Foreman won the world title against Joe Frazier in Jamaica. And he was the only one who tipped Foreman to win. All the Brits, all the Americans, the worldwide, Japanese, German, French, Italian press, every man picked Frazier to beat this young kid Foreman, except for Wally. And he famously came down for breakfast the next morning and got a standing ovation by the pool. And he had a suit on and a hat on, like he thought he was still in London. And as he walked through this area by the swimming pool in Kingston, Jamaica, nodding at people as they stood and cheered him, he fell into the water. And he told me once that once he landed in the water, he said he knew he had to style it out. So he grabbed his hat and carried on walking till eventually he emerged. And they gave him another standing ovation. That's Wally Bartleman, got me started. That's how I went through the back door. I went through the back door holding the hand of a giant.
Okay, that's really interesting then. I never heard of Wally now. Wait, where is Wally now then? How's Wally doing?
Wally's in heaven.
Oh,
Wally went to
oh,
heaven.
Wally.
Well, I think he probably did go to heaven. He went to Wally went a million years ago. He went in about 1988 or 9. Wally, yeah, been gone a long while, but he was part of a pack of great writers from the 70s. And if you ever get a chance, you should maybe try and find some of their stuff. There's a man called George Whiting who wrote for the Evening Standard, and he wrote for the Evening News rather. And I think he's the greatest ever British boxing writer, better than McIlvenney, better than anybody. George Whiting, he's got a brilliant book out. He had a brilliant book out. He's been dead a long time, called Great Fights of the 60s. It's the greatest book. It's the book I recommend to every single wannabe journalist to get. Even if you write about football or horse racing, if you want to be a sports writer, go read George Whiting's Great Fights of the 60s. It's a work of art.
Okay, I'll have to check that out then. I hadn't heard of that book before.
Do it. Put it on your Christmas list.
Well, Christmas is December, so I have to look it on Amazon after. I have to get your book and then his book. Yeah. So let's talk about one of the first kind of major event you covered as a journalist was the Olympics in Atlanta, 1996. If I look back on the Olympics today, you've got so many legends. You got Floyd Mayweather, you got Fernando Vargas, Vladimir Klitschko. You got loads of legends in the Olympics. What was that like? Because that's a very historic Olympics, especially for boxing, and for you to cover it as well.
It was a great Olympics for boxing, but it was a great determined Olympics for the British boxers. Fola Okisola and David Burke both lost in their first fights on about the Monday and the Tuesday of the first week. And what's really interesting, Fred, is that as great as that Olympics is now, and we look back, because Antonio Tarver was there, Vasily Girov was there, as great as it is, when we look back on it, at the time, it was incredibly underwhelming. The Cubans were too technical for the young Americans. The Eastern Bloc fighters were too smart for the young Americans. And contrary to what Mayweather might try and tell you and what the other people who weren't there will try and tell you, there was nothing wrong with the Mayweather decision. There was nothing in the fight. Let's get it right. You know, it wasn't the travesty, the disgusting decision everyone screams about. Trust me, it was not. There was only one American gold, and that was a fluke. David Reed, who had a sort of lazy eye, managed to knock out. He was losing I think it was the third round, knocked out the Cuban. Vladimir was fun, really fun all the way through. But I assure you, I didn't leave there thinking, wow, I've seen legends during this 2 weeks. There's going to be 20 of these guys who are going to give us 100 pay-per-views. One of these guys is going to rule supreme at heavyweight like an all-time great. Mayweather's going to become the richest and most successful and high-profile fighter in history. Fernando Vargas is going to be in about 10 of the greatest fights of the next 10 years. I think, a hand on heart, I wish I could lie to you. I left there thinking, wow, that was massively underwhelming. You know, what 1992, they had Oscar De La Hoya. 1988, they had Lennox Lewis. 1984, they had the Great Americans. What did I get? Vasily Girov and Vladimir Klitschko. I felt shortchanged. And a guy called Somluck Kamsing from Thailand won at featherweight. Whatever happened to Somluck Kamsing, for God's sake? I mean, I left there thinking, oh, sod this. And of course, it was the worst Olympics for GB. They got one gold medal. It was after that everything changed. And so it was a great experience. Don't get me wrong. It was legendary because I was at an Olympics and I dreamed of an Olympics from a very, very young age. And I was there being paid, working, covering the Olympics. How mad is that? But at the time, the boxing, hand on heart, I was really underimpressed.
Well, one thing you were impressed by, I remember reading, I think it was a BBC website. Didn't you really like the Chinese divers there, though?
Yeah, listen, you know what? Because there was a mad situation in Atlanta, where if you've never seen 10-meter diving, it's really odd. Okay, you watch it on TV, you don't really get the idea. But what they had in Atlanta was that it was really steep stand. So where the press were positioned was basically where you're up in the gods, as we call it in boxing. But I was looking directly at the 10-meter diver right in front of me. He or she was about 30 feet, 40 feet away from me. And you're watching someone who's about to do something that's basically physically impossible, hit the water and create all sorts of weight that he or she shouldn't be able to survive. And you're watching them from here and you're seeing their nerves and you're seeing their eyes. And of course, that was not necessarily the start of the Chinese diving supremacy and power, but it was close to the start. So that was one of the bonuses of no Brits being in the boxing. I got to see the water polo, the tennis, the volleyball, the beach volleyball, because that made its debut. I saw about 25 sports really, which is exactly what I do now. Assume, if I'm allowed to get to an Olympics there.
Yeah, COVID. I think we just got to be quite grateful about how our Olympics in London was in 2012 and not 2020, because the Tokyo Olympics, missing all the fans must be very, very disappointing. So right now, this is about. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, it's disappointing for everybody. The fans, imagine some of those. Imagine Gao Yafai if the fans had been able to be there. There would have been 500 friends and family watching him win that gold medal. Unbelievable. I know Fraser Clark was very pleased about it. I remember seeing them too on BBC in the morning. So right now, I think it's my 104th, 105th. I don't have time to count the interviews up. But you've also done tens of thousands of interviews in boxing and other sports as well. Can you remember any standout interviews that you've done personally that kind of in boxing that kind of hit home? Yeah, I think, it cut that into several categories. So post-fight, pre-fight and legend. So pre-fight, sometimes in the last 5 years, Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury don't let you down. They both reached different stages. I once did a piece with Joshua where he was really edgy and he hadn't liked something I'd said previously, and that was great. That was how I like to see Joshua. He looked brilliant in the fight. He destroyed Povetkin, so he was edgy. It paid off. And I did a Tyson Fury interview before the first Wilder fight, where he just laid bare and he was raw and he explained exactly where he was. And I just thought, this man's untouchable. It's going to be almost impossible to beat him at the moment. And of course, Wilder didn't beat him. It was just a draw. And post-fight, that's an interesting thing, because you've got to ask people that are broken. And I managed to get, I waited for nearly 3 hours and I got Anthony Joshua when Madison Square Garden had been cleared, and I just hid in the shadows. Basically, it was terrible. He knew I was there, his people knew I was there, and they came out. Mike Costello was by one door. They had a dressing room that could have about 60 a minute. It was enormous. So Mike Costello was by one door, and I was by the exit, that led to a lift that got you straight outside. So I knew he'd used that. My gut instinct told me. So about 3 hours after he lost to Ruiz, he came out and he stopped. And he was at the head of this group of about 40 people. And his two minders, Neil and James, were either side of him. And they looked at me and he just laughed, shook his head, smiled. And we got in this lift, this service elevator. And it was crowded. And I did this about 5 minutes with Joshua, which was really moving. That was lovely. So that was post-fight. So that's pre-fight, post-fight. But then what really stands out are when you speak to legends, proper legends. I don't mean Chris Eubank, although he's one of the greatest human beings I know, or Nigel Benn. But when you get time with someone like Joe Frazier in his gym in Philadelphia, and you're standing there and behind you, there are pictures, promotional pictures from before his first fight with Ali that were taken in that gym, and you're sitting on the ring and there's the picture and it's 15 feet high. And that's them a month before the fight, standing in the ring you're sitting on, and you're talking to Joe Frazier, or you do George Foreman. I did George Foreman once for an hour in Tokyo when he had this bizarre fight, and you're sitting with George Foreman and he's just going through his fights and you're going, this is as good as it gets. George Foreman is now walking to the ring in the Rumble in the Jungle. Get in! Then George Foreman's waving a flag in 1968, and you're going, yes! You're screaming the place down inside. And you're going, that's good, George. And the first fight with Frazier, and he tells you about and you're just thinking, this has got to end. Someone's going to kick me out of here. So that's good. And I once had, I did something very famous once that I don't get any credit for. I was the first British journalist to have a one-on-one with Reuben Hurricane Carter when he was finally released from prison for being incorrectly sent to prison for a triple murder that he didn't commit. And I managed to track him down. I knew where he was, but I managed to get him to agree to see me. And it took a lot of negotiating. And it was about 1995. So he'd been out of prison for sort of 12 years or so, 10 years, but he'd never done a one-on-one British interview. and I had to go up to Toronto, and it was bad weather. I'd flown up from Vegas. It was bad weather, and he agreed to meet me for a coffee, and he had a couple of friends with him, and they all quizzed me for about an hour. Then he left, and he said, "I'll call you tomorrow." He didn't call me the next day, so I pushed my flight back. And then the next day he did call me. He said, "We'll do it tomorrow." So I had to push my flight back again. And eventually I got him and sat him down in his house, and we went and we sat in his house for about 3 hours. And then he always wanted, when he was in prison, what he always wanted was a sauna. He loved the idea of a sauna. For him, a sauna was just excessive, man. It was about as luxurious as you could get, owning a sauna. And so in his top room in his house, next to his bedroom, facing out over Toronto and the lights, he had the window. It wasn't just a window, it was a sauna that looked out over the city. It wasn't on, but he took me in to just look out from where he sits in a sauna, looking out over the city. So Ruben Hurricane Carter, that was good. I like that one. I don't get any credit for that, which is a bit of a pisser, really. In fact, I don't get any credit. Do you know I've never won anything, Fred?
No,
you know, I've never won an award.
I saw a thing I searched your name on YouTube earlier, and you were going for an award, and you were the 3 other females. I think one was Miranda Cosgrove, and one was Paris Hilton, and then there was another female, and it was you. Didn't you win an award for that or something?
No.
Oh, really?
I've been nominated over 25 times for books, podcasts, short films, and writing. We think it's 25 times, and I've never won. Never won. And that's about 30, whatever it is, about 37 years, and I never won a bloody award. And it's really strange because sometimes I get introduced as award winner, and I always tell people in fact, that's not true. The only award I ever won was the WBO once gave me the International Journalist of the Year, but technically I didn't win it because someone nicked it. Someone collected it for me in Puerto Rico at their annual convention, and he never brought it back to me. And I reject that anyway because I don't want to win an award from a sanctioning body. But that's the only thing I've ever won, and that was a comedy. But yeah, so I've never actually won anything ever, which is a bit of a nuisance. Really, I should have won an award for the Ruben Hurricane Carter interview, in my humble opinion. Bloody yeah, when he died, I should have won an award for my obit, in my humble opinion.
I mean,
who cares?
The way the WBA are handing out belts right now, or the regular champions, interim champions, they're sure they'll give you one eventually, right?
Listen, if I call up Gilbert Mendoza, he might send me 2. I'll even get you one, for God. I'll get you an under-18s belt. I'll get one, you'll get one. We can come on the show again in 2 weeks' time and parade our belts on our shoulders. Now, I'm not going to accept one from a sanctioning body. You can, Fred, but I'm not.
They look quite nice hanging up on the background here. Look quite good.
Yeah, they do, yeah. So that for a game of soldiers.
So one person you mentioned earlier, who I was lucky enough to speak to earlier a week ago, was Miss Mike Costello. As we all know, Mike Costello, he's left the BBC after a very long time there. And so I listen to your podcast. I always listen to your podcast. So does my dad, 5 Live Boxing Stellar, Steve Bunce. And he's not going to be on the podcast anymore, is he?
Well, he did his last one. His last official one was a few days ago, which was a cracker, if I may say so myself. It was a beauty.
I like the interview with AJ's coach, Sean.
Sean Murphy. That was. See, that's a really interesting interview, because hundreds of people have interviewed Sean Murphy over the last 6 or 7 years, and they've not got that. And the reason why Mike got that is that Mike and Sean and me and thousands of other people, we share certain things. We box. We were involved with amateur boxing clubs, so we have a dialogue. We have a connection. So Sean gave Mike that was fantastic, that stuff, and that's why Mike got stuff that no one else has managed to get. So it was a beautiful interview. So the official story with Mike is that he won't be on every week, but he's not gone forever. There will be specials going forward, and there might even be a time as we go forward where he is back on a weekly basis. So, it's not going to be next week or the week after. I tell you this now, it probably won't be for 6 months, but it could happen. In fact, I'd have a slight bet, and I don't gamble. I'd have a slight bet that he's back at some point. Absolutely, yeah. He can't live without us, for God's sake. He's over on DAZN. He's over on the dark side of all the money. He's got a stylist who calls him up and asks him what he's going to be wearing, Fred. He can't deal with that. He's never seen the Star Wars movies. He's never been to McDonald's. He had spaghetti bolognese for the first time last year. How can he have a stylist? Fred, get real. It's not going to happen.
That's the zone treatment for you. That's why I need to get on the zone. You get your own stylist.
Listen, I want a hairstylist. I'll have a hairstylist. They got a magician over there. He can give me a nice barnet. But I'm not. Can you imagine a stylist calling up Costello? If you know Costello, if you listen to the pods, you know a little bit. You know his character. So someone calls him up, probably called Susie or Cliff, and says, "Mike, what are you thinking of wearing on Saturday?" He'll just lose his mind. I know him. He'll literally lose his mind. Anyway, let's move on, Fred.
So yeah, if you ever need anyone to fill in for Mike Costello, I'm always available, Steve. I'm always here.
Fred, listen, I'll keep that.
Do you have any idea who's going to fill in for Mike Costello? Because they're very big shoes to fill.
Yeah, well, that's why we're not going to fill them with that's not going to be the Bunce and X show. It's going to be 5 Live Boxing. And hopefully I'm going to get 5 Live Boxing with Steve Bunce attached to that. But that's being discussed at the moment. It will be, so far, it's been the last 3 or 4 weeks. Barry Jones has stepped in, who I think is the best pundit in the land. I think he's the best co-commentator in the land, period. Barry stepped in. Carl Frampton done one. We might have Dillian White doing one. Carl Froch will do one. David Hay will do one. Bellew will do one. And then we might just recycle. So Frampton, I think there'll be 6 or 7 former fighters, all of whom work in the broadcasting business. So that's important. And they'll all, I think they'll rotate. That's my gut feeling. So if there's a featherweight or a super featherweight, then Barry Jones will have a shout. If there's a heavyweight, Dillian White. If there's someone in the middle area, then maybe Carl Froch, that type of thing. You know, if it's something controversial, then maybe you get Tony Bellew over, that type of thing. So that's what's going to happen.
Do you know who I think you'd be really good with? Because you both got kind of the same character, the same personality. Is Teddy Atlas. I know Teddy's got his own podcast going, but have you ever done anything with Teddy before? Because I think you two would be a great duo.
No, it's fun. No, fun enough, I've not done anything with Teddy over the years. I mean, I first met him about 30 years ago when he was living on the floor at a place called the Thomas and Beckett gym with a man called Dean Powell. He was staying sometimes in the gym. So I first met him then. I don't see him a lot, really, Teddy, because when I'm in Vegas, and I've been in Vegas over 100 times, in New York about 30 odd times or whatever for fights, but he's always working for a TV company. And the Americans are very sort of protective of what we call talent. So they bring Freddie out, so they bring Teddy out, they stick him at ringside, they interview him, they take him to the press conference, they stick him but in front of the fighters, they interview him, and they sort of wheeze him away. So to be honest with you, I don't know if I've spoken to Teddy Atlas in 15 years. But that's a good shout, Fred.
I remember I was listening to his podcast just for the fight, and he was saying that one time he was working at PBC, and all the PBC fighters, they're like 100, odds are like 100 to 1. So obviously it's going to win. And he goes on live broadcast, "I'm sorry for what you're about to watch." And he's one of the pundits, and you kind of gotta respect that. And so before each interview, I always do a lot of, especially for someone like you, I'll do a lot of notes, a lot of questions. But when I searched your name up, I always watch Phil's previous interviews to see what they're like, how much they talk, etc., etc. I searched your name up, Steve Bunce interview. You don't give many interviews. Why is that, Steve?
I do. I've done, when my book came out a couple of years ago, I gave one to Boxing News, which was lovely. Matt Christie, who's a really good guy, done one. And back in 2009, when I did a little tour, I did some. But in general, I don't, because generally, Fred, it's the first question is, how are you? And the second question is, what do you think about Jake Paul? What do you think about Tyson Fury putting on 30 stone? What do you think about Deontay Wilder saying he wants to kill someone? And that, that gets into that clickbaity realm, to be perfectly honest with you, mate. It's as simple as that. So, when I'm, I was at a little show in Walsall in the West Midlands on Sunday afternoon, and about 5 or 6 guys were there with their cameras and, their YouTube channels and their podcasts. And I said no to all 6 of them. And on Friday night in Coventry on the Channel 5 show, I probably said no to about 8 or 9 people. They ask every time, but I just say no, because it just gets a little bit tedious, because you're being asked to comment on, let's say you did last weekend, you're asked to comment on Oscar Valdez, you're asked to comment on the WBC allowing him, you're asked to do this, you're asked to do that, and you've got to be careful with that sort of stuff, because there's an awful lot of legal loopholes there, and some anonymous guy with a camera is okay, but I'm not an anonymous guy. So if I say something bad about Jose Suleiman, or Mauricio Suleiman, sorry, Jose's his dad, then that comes back on me. And I've been in court several times. I've been banned by different promoters. I've lost in court. I've won in court. I've had, or the papers I've worked for, I've had long battles with legal letters changing hands. So I need to be a little bit more respectful like that. So a bit cautious. And that begs the question: why did I agree to do you? And I have no idea, to be perfectly honest with you. I think you bamboozled me with all the names you said you'd done. So I think you had Jack Dempsey and Sugar Ray Robinson on there. So you were telling a fib if you said you interviewed them. But hey ho, I thought if he can fib like that, I'll give him 20 minutes.
I got quite lucky. I just made up your email. I had Mike Costello's DVC email, and I swapped the names around, and then I got a reply, so I got quite lucky there.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, well done.
I just got a couple more questions. I know you're very busy. I was going to ask.
I'm busy from tomorrow, just about every day and night until about the 8th of October. It's a uniquely busy. Two British guys defending world titles in big fights. It's a unique period, Fred. Trust me. At the end, in the next whatever it's, that's like 20 odd days. I'm not sure 20 odd, 20 whatever it is, 23 days. I'm not sure I will have ever worked that many hours apart from an Olympics. So trust me, I'm not always this busy. In June you could have had me for about 20 of the 30 days. So don't worry. I don't want people to think that I'm working basically 363 days of the year, although my family seem to think I work 365, and that's because you tend to, really. You don't turn off. You turn off. Like tomorrow you might not do an interview, but you turn off. You might see something that you make a note about, don't you? It's the way it works.
Tomorrow I'll be chasing a load of people up, friend people you might have cancelled previously, you might not turned up. I'm sending a bunch of emails.
Tell them I did you. Say Steve Bunce did me. If he can do me, you can do me, you miserable fuckers. Something like that. Tell them something like that.
I don't know Bernie.
Go on, Fred, fire away.
I don't know Bernie Bridges at this stage. I was going to ask you who your pound for pound top three are right now. I think that's a bit boring because everyone speaks Canelo, Crawford, etc. But one argument that's always been a massive argument is who are your top three kind of pound for pound best fighters of all time? Because you've been around a very long time. I haven't been around that long. But who are your best fighters of all time, your top three?
Yeah, I like to sort of work in the last 50, 60 years, mostly because there's half a chance you've seen them or more than that, Fred. And this is, I hope you find this helpful as you go forward. It's really nice to, if you haven't seen them, to talk to people that have seen them and people you trust. So, you're not going to see George Foreman fight, but I did. But I didn't see George at his peak. So I talked to someone else who did. So I kind of like to connect it that way. Whereas someone from the 30s, really, there's no one around that I'm ever going to talk to, or the 40s. Even the 50s, really, I don't know anyone that could tell me about fights in the 50s. And there's one or two that maybe saw stuff in the 60s. But so for the last 50 odd years, I would say that I've got a good handle on it. So, John Conte, I saw, and I know now he's a friend, that sort of stuff. So you've got an idea. So fighters from the last 50 years is what I would do. And if I just did Brits in no particular order, it would probably be more than three. It would be Nassim in there somewhere, Lennox in there somewhere, Joe Calzaghe in there somewhere, maybe Ricky in there somewhere, because if you don't just base it strictly on skill and talent, if it's like an old game of trumps where you're finding other abilities and other assets. Yeah, so it'd be a mix of those three. And as for world-wise, Tyson for what he did, obviously the great heavyweights from the 70s. I'd throw Duran in. I'd struggle not to get Sugar Ray Leonard in. It's a difficult one to do 1, 2, 3. And people have corrected me sometimes. Said, Buncey, you didn't have him at 1 last time. I said, I know, but I've watched something 2 nights ago and I've now switched him. I've now stuck Roberto Duran at number 1. and I've got Leonard at number 2, that type of stuff, because, it's fairly established that you've got to have Ali as number 1. Okay, so once you've got Ali as number 1, or really he sort of goes into a subculture, he goes into some sort of subgroup, then the other 3 underneath him. I mean, what about Frazier for what he did in 71 in the first fight? How do you pick another heavyweight? If you've got Ali already, how do you pick another heavyweight in the last 50 years and overlook what Frazier did in that one particular fight? It's anyone that just says just straight away, Fred, Hagler, Hearns, Leonard. Fuck, how, really? Just like that? You can do it? Ali, Foreman, Cooper. I mean, fuck off. You can't. I'm nervous about that. You ask me about great Olympians, then maybe it's a bit easier to list. But for pros, boy, oh boy. And also, ones you saw in the flesh and ones you didn't. And someone, if I could time travel now and go back to the 30s, I might watch Benny Leonard and say that's the greatest fight I've ever seen. Then I might not, So I haven't really given you an answer there. I've just given you 20 names, but that's the way it works.
Yeah, you can't really compare. You can't really compare the weight classes. I only got one more question. Don't need too much of time. But where'd you get the nickname Big Daddy from? Big Daddy Bunce.
Glyn Leach at Boxing News, man that owned and ran Boxing Monthly, rather. Glyn, he died in about 2017 or 16. Anyway, Glyn asked me in 2000 to do a column, and I agreed to it. And that was before Twitter. And he called it Big Daddy. Big Daddy. The original title was Big Daddy Bunce's, or Big Daddy Bunce's boxing column. And then when Twitter came around, someone else set my Twitter account up, and he set it up as Big Daddy. So it's not my it wasn't my choice. Although some people seem to think I gave myself that name. I was, I didn't. It was Glyn Leach. He was a great. He ran Boxing Monthly, and it was during its peak years, Glyn's years. It was untouchable. Sadly, no longer with us. Just like Glyn, really.
Yeah, R.I.P. Well, Steve, that's all my points covered. Thank you so much for your time today, man.
No problem, son.
I always listen to my dad got me listening to the podcast about a year ago, and when I'm biking to boxing or going to school, I always listen to it. So you're going to be at the fight. I might meet you next. Are you going to be at the AJ Usyk fight week around there?
I'm going to be ringside there doing 5 Live co-coms. If you're anywhere near, just try and come and say hello.
Yeah, I won't be at the fight, but hopefully I can try and get in. Daniel Barnard lets me. I'll try and get into the fight week. Just one more thing. So where can you find your book at? I've got it here. Big Fat Short History of British Boxing. It's on Amazon, right?
Yeah, Amazon. It's about I think it might be reduced to about $8.99 at the moment. Honestly, read that book. It'll be a cheat sheet for the rest of your boxing life, mate. I use it. Honestly, anyone that dies, bosh, I get the book out. Alan Minter died last year. I didn't have to do any research. I just got my book out, checked the index, got me Alan Minter pages, read them, made a few notes, wrote 1,000 words. Bosh, like that. Because I trust it. I trust the guy that wrote it.
Yeah, he's all right, the guy who wrote it. He seems all right.
Yeah,
all right, Steve. Thanks so much for your time, mate. It's awesome.
He ain't bad.
All right,
son.
All right. Until next time then, Steve. We'll catch up in a few months then.
Top boy, Fred. Thanks very much. Good luck.
You too. Thank you.